influence physical events, such as his mind willing his arm to raise, and then he raises his arm. However, Dr. Craig can only raise his arm because his mind is functioning through a physical brain. If he were anesthetized, his mind could not will his arm to raise. So anesthesia can so completely wipe out consciousness. How much more can consciousness be eliminated by the death of the entire body and brain? Dr. Craig has never shown that the things his consciousness can will his body to do would persist in the absence of his physical brain. So for all of the promises of salvation, if you only accept Jesus, Christians have never been able to overcome the evidence of the dependence of our consciousness on our brains in order to make a believable argument that we do indeed survive death in some meaningful fashion in the first place. In face of overwhelming evidence of the dependence of consciousness on the brain, and in the absence of evidence that meaningful self-awareness can exist after the destruction of the entire body-brain complex, or can develop without a fully functioning brain that receives sensory input, we must conclude that the survival intact of meaningful self-awareness beyond the grave is highly unlikely, and therefore Christianity's promise of both eternal salvation for believers and eternal suffering for non-believers is false. Dr. Craig is apparently also an opponent of reason. He admitted as much in his book, Reasonable Faith. There, Dr. Craig wrote that essentially the mere faith in the truthfulness of Christianity must take precedence over any evidence. He goes on to write that even if a person is given no good reason to believe, and given many persuasive reasons to disbelieve, that person is still damned for not believing in Christianity. Thus, Dr. Craig, for all of his attempts to bring reason and argument to bear in his public campaign to persuade society that Christianity is true, is actually an opponent of reason and evidence, asserting that reason and evidence cannot be permitted to interfere with an affirmation based upon some subjective inner sensation that he feels he has had that verifies, at least to him, the validity of Christianity. Dr. Craig is in effect saying, because I think I've had an inner communication from God that Christianity is true, all other people will be damned unless they adopt Jesus as their Savior, even if those other people are never presented with persuasive reasons to think that Christianity is true. I think Dr. Craig's claim of inner experience is arbitrary. He claims that if you look within, God will somehow communicate to you that Christianity is true, and that this communication from God is so unmistakable that you have no excuse for not believing it, even if you are never given any other evidence of the truthfulness for Christianity. Well, this raises a major problem of subjectivity. Why should Dr. Craig's sense of what has been communicated to him during his introspection have any greater weight than any other claim derived from introspection? Tibetan Buddhists, for instance, meditators and yogis spend much more time in intense formal introspective practice than do most Christians. Yet the message they seem to get is one of some universal force accessible to anyone who can sufficiently still their mind. Non-Christians of all types, be they followers of other religions, atheists or agnostics, are very often involved in the most sincere study and search for the truth. Yet many of us come to resolutions that differ from each other, but also reject Christianity. Why don't we don't search with less sincerity than Dr. Craig and his fellow Christians. So why does the Christian God hide himself from all of us when it is within that God's power to give us the experience that Dr. Craig claims he has had? The Christian God is really one vicious trickster. In fact, if Dr. Craig is right, that God is a vicious sadist. It means Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, sincere atheists, and agnostics will all wind up in hell, regardless of how sincere our search, questing, and doubt has been. This God, the Christian God, if he experienced, would truly be a sadistic monster, making Hitler look like a Boy Scout by comparison. Christianity cannot be true. Secular humanism is true. Thank you.
If you would please hold your applause. Dr. Craig will now have a 20-minute opening remark.
Wow. You'd think he didn't like me. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join my friend Eddie Tabash in debating tonight secular humanism versus Christianity. Which view is true? It's worth underlining, in fact, that the debate tonight concerns which view is the truth. We're not here to talk about which view I like the best, or which view appeals to me the most, but which view is the truth. So, how do we discover truth? The answer is that we must use logical arguments, formulated according to the basic rules of logic, which have governed all valid reasoning since the time of Aristotle. emotional appeals and colorful rhetoric may move juries, but they're philosophically useless in helping us get at the truth. Now, in order to answer the question before us this evening, we need to have clear definitions of what we mean by humanism and Christianity. Secular humanism, as defined by the Humanist Manifesto, is distinguished by two doctrines. First, that God does not exist, and secondly, that human beings are the foundation of moral value. Thus, in order to show that humanism is true, Eddie must show that both of these doctrines are true. By Christianity, I mean the view that a personal creator of the universe exists, and that he has revealed himself decisively in Jesus Christ. We're not here tonight to debate the inerrancy of the Bible or the immortality of the soul. Rather, we're here to discover whether or not a personal creator exists who has decisively revealed himself in Jesus. So in tonight's debate, I'm prepared to defend two basic contentions. First of all, that there are no good reasons to think that humanism is true. And secondly, there are good reasons to think that Christianity is true. So let's look at that first basic contention together, that there are no good reasons to think that humanism is true. First, is there any good reason to think that atheism is true? Eddie claims that the evil and suffering in the world disprove God. Two things may be said in response to this. First of all, it is generally agreed among philosophers today that there is no demonstrable inconsistency between the existence of God and evil. So long as it is even possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil, it follows that God and evil are logically compatible. Eddie just assumes that if God has such reasons, that these must be evident to us. But clearly there's no reason to think that that should be true. Secondly, evil actually proves the existence of God. The argument goes like this. Step one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Many atheists and theists alike concur on this point. In the absence of God, there's no reason to think that human beings are objectively valuable. They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which are doomed to extinction individually and collectively in a relatively short time. Moral values are just the byproducts of socio-biological evolution, which help to perpetuate the human species in the struggle for survival. To think that we are intrinsically valuable, or that human morality is objective, is to be guilty of speciesism, thinking that your own species is the basis of goodness. If some alien beings, as superior to us in intelligence as we are to pigs and cows, were to visit the earth, they would have no reason to regard us as the foundation of moral value, any more than we do pigs and cows. Thus, without God, everything becomes relative. Step two, evil exists. This is the premise furnished by the atheist. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. Namely, some things are evil. 4, therefore, God exists. If objective moral values cannot exist without God, and objective moral values do exist, as is evident from the reality of evil, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. Thus, far from proving atheism, Eddie has unwittingly given us good grounds tonight to believe that God exists. So, what about that second essential doctrine of humanism, that human beings are the foundation of objective moral value? Is there any good reason to think that this is true? Remarkably, in his first speech, Eddie made no attempt to prove that in an atheistic universe, human beings would have intrinsic moral value. Not only has he not proved this, but I think we've already seen good reason to think that it is false. For consider, either God exists or he does not. Now, if God exists, there's no reason to think that human beings are the basis of objective moral value. Rather, God would be the source and standard of moral value. Human beings are valuable because they're created in the personal image of God. On the